I am Jennifer Morgan. I'm a professor of history. I teach at New York University, where I am also the chair of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. My work is mostly on the 16th and 17th century Black Atlantic world, with a focus on enslaved women and on questions of capitalism and reproduction.
Awesome, and welcome. Thank you. So today we're going to be talking about your article called, now this is in Latin, so I'm going to mess it up, but it's Partus Sequitur Ventrem, Law, Race, and Reproduction in Colonial Slavery.
Exactly, almost perfect. It's Partus Sequitur Ventrem.
Excellent. Excellent. So maybe you could just kind of give us an overview of why you wrote the article and what you hope to achieve with it.
So as I think I say in the text of the article, the 1662 slave code that's passed in colonial Virginia that says that the condition of the child born to an African woman and an English man follows the condition of the mother. That piece of legislation is really important to historians of slavery because it's really the first kind of legal act that says that slavery is going to be hereditary. Now, it's not the origin of the idea, right? Because of course, the idea of race and reproduction was already entangled even as early as the 1660s, but it's an important moment in the history of law and in the way in sort of understanding the ways that early English settlers were working to insert new laws into the canon that would justify and explain and regulate slave ownership. So anyway, so the law is very important, but I felt like, and a lot of scholars have looked at that law, but I felt like fewer people had looked at the law from the perspective of Elizabeth Keye, who's the person who instigates a freedom suit that then leads to the law. And I can talk more about that. So fewer people had looked at the law from the perspective of her or from other women who would have experienced this kind of insertion of the law into their bodies in a very visceral way. And so that was my intention in that article, is to think about what can this help us understand, not just about the legal structures of hereditary racial slavery, but also about the ways in which women experienced that and understood it.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think the one of the things that it's kind of like your closing argument, but I really was struck by this idea that it's the move it's a new narrative, which takes bondage and slavery to a new arena or a new ideology. And maybe using the Key case, you could kind of walk us through what you might mean by that.
Well, I think that we understand race and gender, I think, often as two distinct phenomena, right? And what my work has always been invested in is thinking about the ways in which we cannot think race without thinking reproduction. It doesn't make sense, right? Because the way that race functions is it's this hereditary mark. And let me say, we know that it's a hereditary mark that is very that is not that doesn't code to genes. There are many histories of science that help us to understand how race kind of becomes something, even though it is actually not very much of anything. But for me, we need to always, as we're thinking about what race means and what racial slavery means, we need to think really carefully about how women are embedded in that story. Because I think when one thinks about slavery in the United States, when one thinks about, like, if you imagine, cotton fields or tobacco fields, or if your imagination takes you to the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands, I would imagine that you're thinking about fields that are filled with men, right? And in fact, that's not the case. There are men in those fields, but there are a lot of women who are doing the kind of brutal physical labor that we associate with those early plantations. And we need to understand the impact of those women on the system of slavery, but also the way that enslavement impacts, how slavery impacts the women themselves. What do they know? What do they understand? How are they victimized? How do they craft a kind of story of a future? And those are the questions that always propel my work, and that's the new story that I want us to tell. I want us to think about the way that slave owners understood slavery to be embedded in women's bodies, the way that positioned those women as sexually vulnerable to slave owners, and what that did to families, what it really means to have a system of labor based on the fact that a woman's child is not a member of a family, but is rather a commodity on to be exchanged for money. That is a profound and structural violence that I don't think that we've fully understood.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. I thought the article did a really good job of kind of stressing that. I think that, kind of picking up on what you were saying, the female Black slave women, their reproductive functions became reproductive labor, not just in the labor of having a child, but actually what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It was as important as picking cotton or sugar, or whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe we could kind of talk a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that characterizes North America as opposed to the Caribbean or Latin America is that, in fact, by the end of the 18th century, you had a population of enslaved people that was growing. The population was growing through reproduction rather than through the imports of newly enslaved people. And that has to do with the fact that in North America, for the most part, crops didn't take quite the toll on the body as they did in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the life expectancy of an enslaved person was 7 to 8 years, and people were routinely worked to death. In North America, between the disease environment and the brutality of labor, life expectancy was higher, and the ability to conceive a child was higher. I can talk a little bit more about the specifics of why that is the case, but what it does mean is that in this country, the reproductive work of enslaved women is what was propelling the slave trade, because there is a slave trade in this country after 1807, which is when the actual trade from Africa is made illegal to North America. But the trade is from Virginia and Maryland and Delaware and Georgia into Alabama and Texas and Mississippi and Louisiana. There's an internal trade that is fueled by women's reproductive work, and which has economic consequences, and it has profound emotional consequences.
Let's first talk about the economic, because there's a sentence in your article that kind of jumped out at me, which was, "No white man's child, but all Black women's children were slaves." Automatic. So maybe if you could talk about that hereditary piece that you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, so the text of that law begins by saying, whereas there has been some confusion, in the future, all children born of an African woman and an Englishman will follow the condition of the mother. And that's because Elizabeth Keye was the daughter of an Englishman and an African woman, and was placed by her father in an indenture rather than in a condition of slavery. But then he leaves the colony, he dies, her indenture is transferred to other people and goes on and is illegally extended. And in the end, she is listed under a person's property under Negroes rather than under servants. So she's been turned into a slave. And so she sues for her freedom, and she obtains her freedom. What that is a case of is a white man's child, a white man saying, I am going to decide that this person is free, right? And that prerogative of decision is part of what is the source of confusion for the courts. They're saying you might choose, a slave owner could choose to emancipate his child, right? To manumit his child, to transfer that child from being a piece of property into being his recognized heir. But that's a second step. So the court is basically saying, you as a citizen, as a property owner, as a white man who has legal standing, might decide to change the status of that child, but all children of Black women are necessarily enslaved. And of course, no children of white men who are recognized as legitimate are, right? And I think so for one of the concepts that for me is really important is who is designated as kin, right? Who gets designated as a member of a family, and who is seen as always outside of family. And I mean that legally as well as culturally, right? And that's a landmark moment in the history of race and slavery in this country.
Yeah, and I think that kinship piece could be maybe talked about a little bit more, because I think one of the things that struck me again was the fact that, Black women were not allowed to produce kinship, you argue, and that whatever they did was never free from the market.
Exactly.
So maybe you could kind of explain that to us.
Well, yeah, so there's another law that comes about 20 years earlier, in the 1640s, which designates the labor of all Black women as taxable, and the labor of white women as not taxable. That is a slippery concept, but what it essentially means is that a white woman who works, by the way, like who works on the land, and who is providing labor for her family, is primarily understood to be a wife, right? A member of a family. A Black woman who is also a wife and maybe a free Black woman is legally designated as always a laborer, right? And so her husband or her owner has to pay tax on the value that she brings to the enterprise. And that's an earlier example of the way in which Black women are, even a free Black woman who is married to a free Black man, is rendered through the law as not as outside of family, right? Outside of a kinship network. And I think that the 1662 law, the Partus law, does that. Is like this, it's like a second nail in the coffin, which is to say, yes, there are avenues by which slavery can be ended or interrupted, right? There are manumission processes, et cetera. But fundamentally, the role of Black women in the colony of Virginia, and then ultimately in the country, is to produce labor and to produce commodity. So her family ties are like rendered meaningless, right? In terms of the emotional tie, they're very important in terms of her capacity to enrich the holdings of a slave owner, right? Those, I mean, that is, of course, you and I understand that is family. Her reproductive body is creating family, but from the perspective of the slave owner, those children are noticed, are understood only as assets in his estate, not as members of families who have family ties and family bonds that need to be respected and regarded.
Right, and that had something to do with the with capital accumulation you were just talking about, and this idea that domestic animal legal status was transferred to humans kind of at this
Right.
time.
And that's, I mean, I guess we should cycle back for a minute at that phrase, the condition of the child shall follow that of the mother, which in Latin is Partus Sequitur Ventrem. It means baby follows belly. That phrase, or something like that, exists in English law only in regards to livestock. And this is an important concern for historians of slavery and the law, which is that England did not have slave laws. There was no body of law in England prior to the colonial the acquisition of the colonies in the Caribbean and America that they could just bring over. The Spanish did have slave law, and so there's a different legal tradition there, but the English did not. And so some historians have used that to kind of make an argument that the English were kind of slow to embrace slavery or didn't, et cetera. And we can just set that aside. But the main important thing here is that when looking for a way to kind of legally understand the status of a child born, and again, like born out of wedlock, essentially. And I say this in the article, there is a long tradition in England, a legal tradition for designating bastards or children who were born out of wedlock. And one could have taken those laws and applied them to the children of African women and English men, because of course they were not legally married, right? So we could have had a kind of that sort of legal echo. Do you know what I mean? But instead, the Virginia House of Burgesses, the legislators, looked to a different set of laws, and where they located that were in laws about animal husbandry, which is, so the Partus Sequitur law originally was a law that was used to adjudicate a dispute between an owner of a male animal who, jumped a fence and impregnated a female animal owned by someone else. And so the question then is who owns the foal or the lamb or the calf? And the legal precedent was that the person who owned the female animal owned the product, even if the product was conceived through a male animal. You hear me kind of stumbling over this because in my brain, I know the way that law gets translated onto the ownership of human beings. And the idea of a male animal and a female animal is so powerfully unsettling to me to think about the way that those legislators took that concept as applied to livestock and applied it to human beings. But that's precisely what they did.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the most monstrous aspects of American slavery, and it's inherently violent in a way that we don't think of violence normally.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like we think of the violence of the whip, we think of the scarred body, right? But we also need to think of the violence of interrupted family, the violence of the presumption that this very foundational human experience of gestating a child, which, children are born into all manner of violence and dislocation, et cetera. But the presumption is that the person who births that child is the parent of that child, and that parenthood is not commodified, right? Parenthood can be very problematic. Parenthood can be, one can lose one's parental rights. Like there are all sorts of ways in which I'm not trying at all to say that like there's this sort of romantic mother love always. Like, reproduction is historically contingent, and human beings have different emotional relationships to the process of reproduction at different times. But fundamentally, what this law does, but also what hereditary racial slavery does, is it says that a woman's reproductive capacity is owned by someone outside of not only her, but outside of her family, right? And that all that she produces through her own body belongs to someone else. And that's a powerful act of violence.
Right. And then if you overlay also the idea of the Blackness as that's becoming defined.
Exactly.
And that's inherently violent in the way it's being defined, because if you're,
Exactly.
it's dehumanizing in a way that.
Yes. And it's also because it's a very, like, right now we can think of Blackness and other, racial categories. Like, I think we understand the sort of complexity. We also understand the way that people, use race as a way to trace their own sense of like culture and community in some very important and positive ways. But what we have to remember is that the idea of Blackness and whiteness are developing in this time period. English people don't think of themselves as white. They think of themselves as English, and Spaniards don't think of themselves as white. They think of themselves as They might think of themselves as Catholic versus Protestant. They might think of themselves as speaking one language versus the other. There's no Europe, right? Europe is like, I'm a historian. I cannot keep track of how many wars. Like, Europe is at war internally for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? But part of what slavery does is it produces this coherent category, right? So that not only does it produce Europe, but it produces whiteness, and it produces Africa, and it produces Blackness, right? As though one's fundamental value, and it's not as though, because one's fundamental value is defined by whether your value occurs inside the marketplace or outside of it, right? So for white people, your value comes outside the market. It comes in your community and in your family and in your work and in all these other ways. For Black people, your value comes only in the dollar amount that is assigned to you on the auction block or in the moment of sale. And that, again, as you said, is such a profound place of violence. It's such a violation of human connection. And that's what racial slavery is.
Right. And then, I don't know if you want to get into this, but the Francis Drake example that you have with the kidnapped Maria shows, I think you're trying to illustrate how that event is also kind of instilling race into the colonial project.
Yes,
so we can see how it creeps into not only from the colonies, but then into colonialism itself.
Exactly. And I think that it's what I think is so important about that example. So there's three things that are going on with Maria in Francis Drake's voyage. One is that Maria was being raped by members of the crew without that being an issue, right? Like, it wasn't that fact was not noted in the log. That was just a sort of matter of course. The problem is that Maria became pregnant. And so the captain and the crew were suddenly faced with the reality that if that baby was born and the baby's color made it clear that she had been impregnated by one of the English crewmen, that could cause difficulty, right? In England. It wouldn't have caused difficulty if they were on their way to the Americas, but if they landed in England with this mixed race baby, that was too complicated. So Drake then puts her off on this abandoned, not abandoned, it's like an empty island with two Black men and some seeds, right? As though this is going to, and he claims the island for the crown. And so it's a very tiny and obviously completely unsuccessful example of what English colonial occupation will mean. It means you put Black and brown people on land that their presence as your property serves to kind of cohere your claim to the land. So it's this other thing. It's about slave labor, about the transport of African people to the Americas to claim land that belonged to indigenous people, right? Like it's a cycle in which sex and race and colonial occupation are really like intertwined.
Right, and then America had to fight a war to resolve it, because as we moved west, we had to figure out what we were going to do with that land.
Exactly.
So yeah, this is great. If you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to kind of drive home as far
Well, I would just say that I think that part, we started out by saying, by talking about why it was important to understand the connection between reproduction and race in the history of slavery. But I think that we need to also understand that as we try to navigate the aftermath of slavery and the afterlives of slavery in our current moment. Motherhood, Black women continue in the current day to have our reproductive capacities kind of marked as good or bad, or as legitimate or illegitimate, in ways that are not just about like random ideas, but that are structured. And we can look at this in the way that Black motherhood gets criminalized and devalued and associated with criminality, or associated with substandard housing and poor parenting and all of this. And I think we have to ask ourselves really difficult questions about the impact of racism and structural racial violence on Black families. And we need to look to the long ago past to help us understand our struggles to alleviate poverty and pain and racism in the present.